All right. Hey, everybody, and happy Easter. Hope y'all are having a wonderful day. So tonight we only have 30 minutes because, of course, the Satsang follows. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to share Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness. But I just want to say that I'm not here to teach what Dr. David Hawkins teaches. I'm, still here with Regina Dawn Akers teaching. His map of consciousness is just another way to look at what I teach. So we'll be looking at RDA teachings, not Hawkins teachings. I can't even answer any questions about Hawkins teachings. But I will share my screen and we'll have a peek at this map of consciousness. So this is Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger. I want to start by looking at it down at the bottom. And if any of y'all are familiar with Dr. David Hawkins' work, you know that he numerically categorizes all of these things from a low category of 20 all the way up to a high category of 1,000, right? He uses numerical numbers. What I want to show you is, it's funny because the line here isn't drawn where I would draw a line, but I would draw a line between pride and courage. Courage is where you get to level 200 and above using his numbers. Below courage, you're below level 200. And so I would draw a line right here, and everything that is below level 200, which is pride, anger, desire, fear, grief, apathy, guilt, and shame. All of this is what I would call the lower ego. Whenever you hear Regina talking about the purification process, she's talking about purifying all of these things in the lower ego. One thing I want to talk about quickly is grief. Grief is not grieving when you lose a loved one or when you lose a pet or something like that, which is a temporary experience. Grief is living in grief. Grief is always regretting, always wishing things were different, right? It's a state of staying there all of the time. This isn't talking about that temporary experience that you experience if you lose your parents or a child or another loved one. So I just wanted to make that clear. Notice he has the word regret here. You live in regret, right? I showed you, and I think I need to pull up another map. I showed you another map one time. Let me pull that up for you. If I go into, let's see, I think I have all my clarifies stuff right here. This is the map I want to show you. You might remember this map that I'm showing you now, which I said came from the text. And when we looked at this map before, normal human consciousness is this level that's called who I think I am. And this is all of your thoughts about who you think you are. And we talked about underneath that is the individual subconscious. This individual subconscious is also that lower ego. This individual subconscious is the same things that we're looking at on Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness below level 200. So I'm just going to go back to that map for a second. So again, shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, and pride. This is the stuff that blocks our clarity. Whenever the ego starts speaking to us and it's using any of these songs, right? These are all songs the ego sings, and we start listening to it, we lack clarity completely. And this is what's important for you to know. You cannot be in pride and be clear at the same time. You cannot be angry and be clear at the same time. You cannot be caught up in desire and be clear at the same time. In fact, I have a funny story about the desire. Once upon a time, we had a friend who lived with us who had lots of desires. He liked to have massages. He liked to have acupuncture. He liked to have all these kinds of things done to his body, that made him feel good. And he was always wanting to go and have something like this done. And it was funny because we would drive down the street and he would see a sign that would say something like massage therapist. He'd say, "Oh, that's guidance." Let's pull over and let me go in and get a massage. And Jasmine watched this happening for some time. And she wanted to go to Disney World. And one day a Disney World commercial came on. She goes, "Ooh, that's guidance. We're supposed to go to Disney World because a commercial came on." But this is how desire keeps us in lack of clarity. When we desire anything, other than, of course, awakening, that's the one exception, awakening to the truth, however that spiritual aspiration may look for you. When we desire anything, our mind will come up with ideas, or maybe things will look like it's spontaneously making it happen, like, "Ooh, there's a sign for massage," or "Ooh, there's a commercial for Disney World." And we think that we're being guided to that, but we really don't know guidance. One thing that Spirit told me is, in order to know guidance, you must first become desireless, because personal desires block guidance. Personal desires are really self-will, and self-will blocks guidance. So when we're caught up in desire, we cannot be clear. Fear is actually, it's funny, fear is very similar to desire in the way that it blocks clarity, because whatever you fear, you actually desire to avoid. You see what I mean? They're really kind of the same thing. So, if you fear, I don't know what you could fear. I've gotten so out of touch with things like that. If you fear running out of money, that was something I feared once. So if you fear running out of money, then you may see something and you think, "Oh, that's there to help me make money. That's guidance," right? But it isn't guidance. It's fear, right? It's fear. Grief, grief completely blocks any kind of clarity, just because this is just a great big wishing everything was different than it is. Apathy, apathy is just turning off to everything. You just turn yourself off to everything as a type of defense mechanism. And when you turn yourself off to everything, all emotions, all thoughts, you also turn yourself off to guidance. You've just kind of like turned an off switch. And of course, guilt and shame, we all know how guilt and shame really block our clarity. So everything below level 200 on Dr. David Hawkins' map, this is what needs to be purified in us. And whenever I speak about purification, what I really mean is, this is what we have to learn not to believe when it shows up. I'm not saying that it won't show up. That's the big difference. This is what we learn not to believe. I loved what Susan said this morning in the weekly gathering when she was talking about fear. She talked about the fear of doing her first weekly gathering. And she said something like, I can't quote her exactly, but she said something like, she's still feeling the fear, but she learned not to let the fear, or she decided not to let the fear stop her. Right? She was still feeling the fear of doing the gathering, but she decided not to let the fear stop her. That's an example of not believing the fear. Right? It's there, but it's not stopping her. So again, everything below level 200, pride, anger, desire, fear, grief, apathy, guilt, shame. This is the lower ego. And as we hear any of this in our mind, we want to learn not to believe it. That takes us to the courage stage, as he words it, the level, it's level 200 to level 249, I guess. The courage stage is what I would call the purification phase. And in my experience, the purification phase was something that I decided to do. What I decided to do was that I was going to use everything in my experience for the purpose of healing my mind. That's the language I meant then, but I meant letting go of believing everything in this lower ego. And so it was a really interesting period. I've often said that it was 5 years, but I recently went over all of my early teachings. And so I was able to really get a little more clarity on how this happened for me. It was really more like 4 years. But for 4 years, I was 100% focused on purifying the lower ego, getting to where it did not really have an effect on me anymore because I did not believe it when it came up. I love that he's called this courage, even though I call it purification. I love that he calls it courage because I found that it takes courage. It takes courage because the ego is brilliant. And the ego, as Peace Pilgrim said, the ego knows the weakest spot in your armor. In other words, the ego knows exactly what story to tell you to get you to listen. And, the stories that it might tell me and the stories that it might tell you are completely different stories, because maybe the weakest spot in your armor isn't the same as the weakest spot in my armor. But this is why it takes courage. It takes great courage not to listen to the ego and to allow the lower ego to be purified, or in effect to become ineffectual. That's really what we mean. It becomes ineffectual because it acts like it's trying to protect you. It's trying to take care of you. It's trying to get you what you want most of all. And so if you are practicing not listening to it, you're practicing not listening to stories of how you'll be protected. You're practicing not listening to stories of how you're going to be happy, how you're going to be safe, how you're going to be what you want. So you see, it takes great courage to choose not to listen to all of the stories that come from below level 200. And the interesting thing is, as long as we continue to listen to these stories and believe these stories, we stay attracted to the energies below level 200 on the chart. We stay attracted to pride, anger, desire, fear, grief, apathy, guilt, shame, and maybe not all of them. Like I don't think in this entire lifetime I ever experienced apathy to probably hardly any degree. Like that's completely alien to what I have experienced. I also really didn't experience a lot of regret, a lot of grief. That was pretty alien, but I experienced a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of fear, a lot of desire, a lot of anger, and a lot of pride. Right? So it may not be that you experience everything as a part of this personality in this lifetime, but there's a heavy attraction to below level 200 as long as you're listening to those stories. And in that way, you will never be free of the lower ego, right? Free of the suffering that it causes. If you allow yourself to go through the courage stage, and remember, I said that for me, this was a decision. This didn't accidentally happen to me, right? This wasn't an accident. This was something that I decided I was going to use everything that came up in my experience to, as I said, my language was heal my mind. And you can hear some of those stories if you listen to the early teachings that I posted recently. But after I went through those 4 years, and I had purified this lower ego. Now, this doesn't mean the ego is gone. It just means there's no longer a heavy attraction to these energies below level 200. And so what happened after I went through that 4 years of purification, I entered into what Dr. David Hawkins calls neutrality. And neutrality is a funny name for it. If I had named it, I would have named it peace, even though he has peace way the heck up here, which shows there's another level of peace. But let me tell you why I would have called this peace. Because compared to, right, you got to look at your experience, compared to your previous life, where you were heavily attracted to the energies below level 200, and even compared to the courage and everything you went through in the purification process, oh my gosh, neutrality feels like peace. Suddenly, things are easy. Suddenly, you're just happy. All these things that used to bother you in one way or another, or worry you in one way or another, they don't. Notice he says here that your associated emotional state is trust, right? You move into a feeling of trust. And notice he says your view of life is satisfactory, right? It's good. You feel content. You're happy. And I was in this neutrality stage for a while. I think what pushed me out of the neutrality stage, I exited the courage stage sometime in 2008. In 2008, I exited the courage stage, finished my purification. My purification had begun in 2004. And I entered into the neutrality stage. I was in this neutrality stage from, we'll call it the fall of 2008, probably, all the way until the winter of changing from 2011 to 2012, probably. You can't pinpoint these things. These are general. But what happened in 2012 that began to move me beyond the neutrality stage, that was the year that I was guided to take a year of increased silence. And I spent 5 to 7 hours a day contemplating the 7 steps to awakening. And that moved me out of the neutrality stage into what he calls the willingness stage. I would not have called it the willingness stage. I would have called it service. That's when I received the guidance to start awakening together. And my life became very heavily involved in service. I was always in some type of service, but it was much lighter prior to the guidance to start awakening together. It became much more a part of the forefront. And what I found is really purified. There's another type of purification. What I found is really purified through the willingness and the acceptance, and even the love stage, willingness, acceptance, and love. I'm going to skip reason for now. I'll come back and tell you why in a moment. Willingness, acceptance, and love, they are a process of letting go. It's still letting go of ego, but it's not those lower energies because they're already taken care of. But this is the process of letting go of any leftover self-will. And it's funny the kind of self-will you can have that isn't, for example, strong personal desire. One type of self-will, for example, that you find up here in the higher energies is thinking you know what's best for everyone. Sometimes it's called grandiosity. But let me give you examples because it can be much more subtle than it sounds. For example, thinking that I know Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. See, that's thinking, I know what is best for others. Do you see that? So it can be very, very subtle, and therefore it can be very easy to miss. And so as you go through this service stage and this acceptance stage and even this love stage, what you really start noticing is anything in you that is out of harmony with complete surrender and complete, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the word for it. It's complete knowing that everything is perfect all of the time. So anything in you that would keep you from being completely surrendered, or that would keep you from seeing everything as perfect, absolutely perfect all of the time, these are the things that are being let go in the willingness, acceptance, and love stages. So there's still a purification going, but it's a different kind of a purification. I remember once Peace Pilgrim talked about when she transcended the lower ego, right? She quit experiencing the hills and valleys of the purification path. She said there was still learning, but there was no longer a struggle with the ego. In other words, she was no longer pulled down into these energies, these lower energies, but there was still purification going on. She called it learning. There was still learning going on. Then above level 500 to 539 love, when you get into joy, this is where you're really beginning to experience the second principle of God and then the first principle of God. The second principle of God in the lower levels between 540 and 1,000, and then the first principle of God in the highest levels. So as you can see, there's an awful lot that goes on prior to the second principle of God. And what happens nowadays is a lot of people I don't know how else to say this, so I'll just say it. A lot of people believe themselves to be awake when they are still heavily attracted to these lower energies. They haven't gone through that purification process. I went through a course a few years ago called the Finders Course. And it was really interesting because, in the Finders Course, you really focus very heavily on meditation, some other practices too, but it's very heavy on meditation. And actually, they give you a different meditation each week to really focus on. And it's a very powerful course. It's 4 months long. But what happens at the end of the course is something like 70-some percent. I don't remember if it's 73, 75, I don't remember what it is, but a large number of participants declare themselves awake or enlightened at the end of the 4-month course. And so what happens is, they then use that information that 70-some, I'll say 73, but don't quote me on that because I'm just making that up. I don't remember the exact detail. 73% of people awaken. And so more people take the course and of course, report having awakened. But what's really interesting is I'm sure that, through all of that meditation, there has been some kind of a positive change that has occurred. But what's interesting is those lower energies have not been purified. And so what the Finders group has done, and they're doing it in a very subtle way, but they're trying to talk to people about, maybe there's some of this stuff still here that needs to be cleaned up. I've heard Adyashanti do this too. Around Adyashanti, there's a lot of people who have declared themselves awake. And I've heard him try and in a very subtle way talk to them that maybe there's still this stuff here that needs to be cleaned up. So I think what I really want to say is, in today's popular enlightenment culture, there's a strong desire to see yourself as awake. But to see yourself as awake and to still be heavily attracted to anger and fear and pride and shame and guilt is a waste of a lifetime. You're just deeper in denial than you were when you started. So it's really worthwhile to take the time to make the decision, to make the conscious decision that you are going to purify those energies. And again, your job then becomes not believing them. And my experience is, if you make that decision, they're going to beat up on you. You know, it's like the Course says something about the ego is suspicious at best, and then it becomes vicious. When you decide that you are going to let go of the lower ego, that's when it becomes vicious. And so what you want to remember is, if the ego is getting vicious, if the voice is getting louder, if the desires are getting stronger, if the fears are becoming bigger, that's just a sign that you've made the decision. And that's you just want to buckle down and practice rest, accept, and trust. And don't listen. This is all temporary. See yourself in that courage stage, and have courage, because it takes courage. And if you don't listen to that lower ego, it has to die, because the only thing it lives off of is your attention. Your attention is its food. So if you are not giving it attention purposefully, you're practicing rest, accept, and trust. You're choosing not to listen to these stories in the mind, right? You're doing all of this. And again, you can go listen to my early teachings. There's 275 videos that talk about how I did this, right? You will transcend those energies, and you can do it in a very short time. I mean, 4 years is a short time. 10 years is a short time. 2 years is a short time. But you can't transcend the energies as long as you continue to listen to those stories and do what the ego says to do. So we're about out of time. I guess what I will do next week when we come back is I will start by seeing if you guys have questions about this. You know, so think this week about, have you been through the courage stage? Are you in the courage stage? Have you been avoiding the courage stage? Do you have questions about the courage stage? Do you want more than anything to avoid the courage stage? And you'd like me to help you talk yourself out of that. And then next week, we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. That's it for tonight. We're out of time. See y'all.